Hello, everybody. Welcome to ClimeCo's webinar on SBTi's newest version of the Corporate Net Zero Standard V2. I'll give participants another 30 seconds or so to join the room and get their settings working before we start. In the meantime, I'll just mention that all participants will be muted for the duration of the presentation today and that the chat feature is disabled. We do encourage viewers to submit questions via the Q&A box on your Zoom client, as we will have time to address at least some of the questions at the end of the presentation. If you have any further questions or yours is not addressed today, please feel free to reach out to us directly. After the webinar is concluded, we'll be following up with the slides and the recording for you all to view at your leisure. I'll pause for a few more seconds as we wait for the last few people to trickle in. Okay, looks like we've reached a quorum, so let's get started. We're very excited to dive in with all of you to the most recent changes to SBTi's Corporate Net Zero Standard version 2 from the draft release last month. From the ClimeCo side, we've got three SBTi certified experts leading the discussion. Emily Damon, our Chief Growth Officer, David Prieto, a Vice President and the leader of our Sustainability Advisory Team, and myself, Garrett Correga, a Director on the Sustainability Advisory Team. We are thrilled again to have Kyra Power here from SBTi to provide clarity, answer questions, and share some insider perspectives. Kyra, I'll pass it over to you for a quick intro.
Hi, everyone. Well, thank you so much to the ClimeCo team for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to come and kind of hear your take on the SBTi's Corporate Net Zero version 2, second public consultation, but also to provide anything that I can in terms of answering your questions and giving you a little bit more of a peek behind the scenes at SBTi and really like what has gone into this version of the draft. As Garrett mentioned, I'm an engagement manager focused on the North America region for the SBTi, and it's really great to be here today. So I'll hand it back over to you, Garrett.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyra. Yeah, we are super thrilled to have you here, and I'm going to hopefully get some great insider perspectives. So we'll be grilling you with some questions. Before we dive into that, let's start with a walkthrough of SBTi and the role the Corporate Net Zero Standard plays, followed by a quick overview of the newest version 2 draft. After that, we'll spend most of our time focusing on the 5 critical changes that we want to talk about that are laid out by version 2 as compared to the current standard and discuss their potential implications. We'll wrap up with a quick look ahead and then, of course, our Q&A session. First, I'll pass it off to you, Emily, to get us started.
Perfect. Thanks, Garrett. Yeah, really nice to be here with everyone today. First place to start, just very briefly, for anyone who doesn't know who ClimeCo is, we are a global decarbonization company. We've been around for 15 years doing this work. We identify, invest in, and implement emission reduction projects, both industrial and nature-based. We also have a trade desk and digital products that help monetize those emission reductions. And then we're complemented by an advisory team working on strategies, targets, and that implementation piece. We work with a lot of industrial clients based on our history reducing emissions in industrial settings. So we've got a lot of clients in cement, steel, chemicals, plastics, energy, you name it. We also work with some of the world's largest consumer-facing brands. So that's a bit of the perspective that we bring to the conversation today. So let's see, getting this to move forward. Before we really dive into this V2 draft, this latest release from SBTi, the place we wanted to start was, who is SBTi? What is the role of this net zero standard? Just as a brief refresher. So a quick look at some history. SBTi, as a reminder, was founded in 2015, just after the signing of the Paris Agreement. And really the intent of the initiative was to say, how can a company set a climate target that is showing that it's doing its fair share to meet the ambitions of the Paris Agreement, the ambition to keep that global average temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius. So that was really the initial intent, and the initial set of rules from SBTi focused on short-term climate targets in the 5 to 15-year time range. So in that contingent, in that cohort, we saw a lot of 2030 targets, which we're eagerly awaiting, to see how companies progress toward those. 2021 marked an important moment for SBTi with the release of the Net Zero Standard version 1. And that was the first time SBTi provided guidance and rules around long-term targets or targets for the 2050 year. There were also a few new elements of the requirements that were introduced at that moment in 2021. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. But fast forwarding now to 2025, where we are, version 2 of the Net Zero Standard is in this draft phase. And the first draft was released in March of this year. The second draft released most recently in, November 6th, I believe it was. So we're in the process now of digesting this second draft of V2, and that's what we'll spend the hour today with you all focused on. But Kyra, just thinking about the history, SBTi, you live and breathe it every day. Anything you'd add here?
Sure. Thanks, Emily. I think one thing that's just really exciting and that we are very proud of is just the exponential growth that we've seen since we were first founded. It's been about a decade of the SBTi, and as of this week, we update our numbers every week, but we've got over 12,000 companies that are involved in the SBTi. So whether they have validated targets or commitments to set targets, and of those relevant to this net zero standard, we have 2,200 companies with validated net zero targets, and we continue to see growth quarter by quarter. So we're really excited. This standard is obviously important in kind of setting the tone and the pace of net zero going towards 2050. And obviously it'll affect, quite a few companies, but we are just so grateful for the growth that we've seen, and we hope to, continue and bring more companies on board.
Yeah, really appreciate it. And I know David, Garrett, and I, over the years that we've been working with companies on climate strategy, SBTi really has provided this North Star, this really useful guiding point for everyone to be working toward. What does ambitious action look like? And we've also been really excited, and as we'll talk about in this next hour, some of the changes that SBTi is considering to make that more doable, more approachable, more pragmatic. So really grateful for the role SBTi has played. So then just quickly, the overview of the net zero standard, as we mentioned, SBTi's initial role was providing rules on setting short-term targets. And really those short-term targets were focused on a company needs to look at its scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and needs to find ways to reduce those. That was the core of SBTi. That always has been, and I believe always will be. So the net zero standard sort of built on that and said those emission reductions of scope 1, 2, and 3 need to continue until mid-century. That was really kind of the foundational element. But the two new elements that the net zero standard introduced, taking it out to this long-term view, one was removals, and we'll talk about those in more detail later, but the need to actually suck greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere through things like direct air capture, planting new trees, those removals being used to neutralize emissions in 2050 and probably leading up to that as well. So removal is one new element. The second new element is this recommendation to support emission reductions outside of scope 1, 2, and 3. At one time, it was called the Beyond Value Chain Mitigation Compensation. In this hour, you'll hear us talk about ongoing emissions responsibility. But that recommendation to support emission reductions beyond your scope 1, 2, and 3 as you work toward net zero. Those were kind of the key components of the net zero recipe. So let's see. I think we're ready just to talk about then an overview of what does V2 look like and how is it different in the big way. So David, let me turn to you.
Thank you, Emily. First of all, thanks, Emily, for reminding us that the current guidance that is live is the version 1.3, and what we're discussing is version 2 and the second public consultation of it. So what we've noticed since the change of that first public consultation is a continued response of the market's feedback from SBTi, where the guidance has been consolidated. It used to be around 132 pages, and now we're under the 100-page mark. And I think that call from David Kennedy to have a pragmatic, action-oriented standard is one that we feel continues to be a striding North Star when it comes to this second public consultation that we'll be looking over. The guidance and the structure of this new standard is around 9 key areas, and we will dive into each of them in more detail throughout the course of this presentation. But one of the key things to have in mind are updates such as in the net zero ambition, there is a call out to considering publishing a transition plan. There are significant changes to Scope 1 and Scope 3 target setting mechanisms. There is now that ongoing emissions responsibility and recognition, which we'll dive in deeper, and then very requested guidance on claims and different types of claims. So that to be said is this version 2 that is in its second public consultation is structured in a way to make it easier for corporates to follow and addresses some of the gaps that all of us have engaged with during the first 10 years of the SBTi. Kyra, is there anything you would add to the journey that we got to this point?
Thanks, David. I guess I would just say that, version 1.3 is still the best available net zero standard that exists in the market today for corporations looking to take ambitious action. So we still encourage companies who have yet to set a net zero target to do so under version 1.3. We are committed. The exact way that we'll do this has not been mapped out, as it is somewhat dependent on this consultation process, but we want to ensure kind of a smooth transition for companies with validated net zero targets under our current version to this version 2. So I think it's just important to note, our current versions you can absolutely use now. And version 2, again, nothing is final here. I think it's always really important to note before we start diving into some of these changes that everything is still in consultation mode. Nothing is final, nothing is operational until it goes through our formal governance process and approval from our board and is released out into the public, which we're anticipating will happen in 2026.
Thanks, Kyra. And I think thank you all of the audience for joining this presentation, because at the end of the day, the value and the utility of this standard when it's finalized and publicized is a function of all of our feedback. So on to the next slide. One of the core, Emily, Garrett, and I will discuss with Kyra the 5 key changes that in our experience are relevant to clients and partners that we've been working with over the past decade. The first one is just an increased flexibility on how we approach Scope 1 and Scope 3 emission reduction targets, the expansion of market-based accounting beyond Scope 2 to Scope 1 and Scope 3, that responsibility mechanism for ongoing emissions, the acceleration of the timeline to create the near-term demand for carbon removals, and the refined requirements for Scope 2 and renewable energy credits. All in all, I think a key pattern remains from the first public consultation, which is SBTi acknowledges the market-making role they play and the demand signal that all market players are asking for to be able to accelerate deep decarbonization across all sectors. All right, and with that being said, I think, Emily, off to you.
Wonderful. So we're going to step now into a little more discussion of each of those 5 areas that David just outlined, starting with flexibility for Scope 1 and 3. So what you're looking at here is just a quick summary of the criteria or the rules in the net zero standard that pertain to Scope 1. We've provided these tables throughout this presentation, really just as a reference for companies who are looking to respond to the public consultation. But we'll move past them fairly swiftly and step one level deeper. So on the topic of Scope 1, one of the ways that SBTi has provided more flexibility in this latest draft is by providing new types of targets that are eligible. And I think these are really exciting. These are really positive. A lot of companies that we've worked with have applied the SBTi rules to their footprint and said, nope, can't do it. This would be, existential crisis, too costly, don't see the path, don't have the technology, any number of challenges on the path to these ambitious targets. So I think the opportunity to have different types of targets, especially some that are pointed at companies who are in positions that have made historical SBT rules challenging, is a really positive thing. One example is a renewable energy company. The best thing they can be doing to support a net zero transition is to make more renewable energy available. But with the traditional rules, they had to reduce their emissions just as much as anybody else, rather than growing capacity, expanding production. But this alignment-based target option for Scope 1, I think may really be a good fit for companies like that. So that's one of the places we see flexibility. I'll jump now to Scope 3, which is where there's, I think, a lot to dig into. And I know SBTi sees Scope 3 as one of its big opportunities to create impact. We see the huge market making potential with this. So again, I'll move past this slide, but it's here for those who want to respond to the public consultation in the future. But taking a look now at a couple of details, a couple of places where there is this new flexibility for Scope 3. One of the things that is introduced in this latest draft is the idea of these 4 intervention levels. So these are different ways that companies can show progress, flexibility on how companies meet their targets. And again, I see this, and I think many of us see this as a really big positive. It's so often the case that there's a limited demand signal for emission reductions, and it may not be physically connected to the companies who are sitting on cost-effective, scalable emission reduction projects, that are awaiting funding right now. And so having these different intervention levels really, I think, will allow the market to find the connections between that supply and demand more efficiently. But yeah, Kyra, I guess I'd turn to you here with, the enthusiasm we have on this Scope 3 flexibility. Is there anything you'd want to add on the intervention levels or Scope 3 more broadly?
No, I mean, Emily, I think you gave a really great overview here. I think, again, just, we've learned a lot about Scope 3, right? We've learned a lot about the challenges. We've learned a lot about the constraints. We've heard a lot from the market on, what's kind of needed in the near term and what really will move the needle for a lot of folks and what will start getting that finance flowing and the investments flowing, et cetera. So I think, again, we are just trying to take a more actionable and pragmatic approach while ensuring that we're not losing sight of that ambition, and we are really prioritizing those emission sources and those activities that we believe will result in the greatest emission reduction. So you'll certainly see, the Scope 3 framework looks a little complex at first glance in reading, but the intention is really to help focus companies into the sources and the activities and the interventions where they will have the most impact and where we know it's most critical to decarbonize.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. And I think this is one of the places where there's a sizable change even since the draft that came out in the spring. So some of the changes from the spring draft are modest or step changes, but this is one of the ones, Scope 3, I think is adds a bigger movement, which was exciting to uncover. So maybe, speaking a little bit about complexity, you mentioned it, Kyra, we wanted to also show this summary that I think you had provided many of these graphics actually from a webinar you gave, so appreciate you for that. But just on the topic of complexity, I think that's one of the things that we often weigh. And I think we're really excited about the flexibility that's been provided for how companies meet the targets. What we're showing here is in criteria 18, there are many new target types provided for Scope 3, but they're applicable to only some of the Scope 3 categories. And so you could end up with a, mishmash, a Scope 3 set of targets, 5 or 6 targets for one company just within Scope 3. So a bit of complexity / flexibility, depending on how you see it, on how you set targets. So curious, I don't know, Kyra, if you wanted to add anything further on, maybe how this came to be or thoughts on this piece as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it, yes, recognizing, I think we have gotten a lot of questions and I imagine we will get some feedback around this particular point in terms of, wait a second, all of these various target types and options and specific emission sources that must be covered, like this is a lot to handle. And at the same time, I do think it's less a function maybe of the standard and more a function of the various types of emissions that are all bundled within Scope 3. It is complex, right? There are a lot of different emission sources and there are various ways to intervene and reduce those emissions. And so Part of it, I think, is just the kind of nature of the beast of scope 3. And it's hard to simplify something that is just so inherently dynamic.
Yeah.
However, that being said, I expect, this round we will receive some more feedback, and that's exactly why these consultation exists, right? That's why it's open to the public. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on if there is room for improvement here.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a fascinating. We've debated it internally, even just David Garrett and I, at some length. Um, and I think two maybe pieces of commentary that come to mind for me on this topic. One is there's a very advanced company who's got an aggressive scope 3 target within a net zero target. They are working hard to procure emission reductions. They've been working with unbundled EACs. They've taken a bold stance of we're going to use these and the standards shall follow, or this is how we're going to get the scope 3 reductions we need. And we see that they have a team of people, they have a process, they have budgets, they have a whole thing set up that's very, I'm sure took time and takes people resources. And one of the biggest challenges I think that they face is not access to good quality emission reduction projects, but just, personnel constraints. And so when I look at this, sometimes I get a little fearful. Is that company going to need 5 different teams going out to sign scope 3 emission reduction contracts? So I think, yeah, this, like you said, I think this will be a great place for folks to weigh in.
Well, Emily, this might be a slight plug for people like ClimeCo, but there is this whole industry and body of folks who are ready to support companies who maybe don't have the internal expertise. And I think also we're trying to recognize that, and you'll see something that maybe we didn't cover at the very start of this is that this whole standard, we've introduced company categorization. So category A companies are those who are larger, based in higher income regions. They generally have more kind of stringent requirements than category B companies. Category B companies, smaller, historically kind of what we've called small, medium enterprises or SMEs, based in maybe medium, lower income regions, and they have a bit more flexibility and a bit more just streamlining, simplification, realizing that, to your point, resources are different, there are constraints, etc.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you calling that out. The category A, B categorization is a big one, and we don't go into depth in this presentation, but definitely encourage folks to check that out. There are some important things that category B companies are not required to do, which I think is a great recognition of those resource constraints. Okay, well, stepping now into the second of the 5 key areas that we wanted to talk about, let's talk a little on market-based accounting. This is a place, again, where we see SBTi's sort of direction of travel over the past several years as a really positive thing. This table is showing, again, the criteria where market-based accounting is showing up in the standard. But the important highlight note is that SBTi took a bold step and said, market-based accounting has a role to play in how companies meet their targets for scope 1, 2, and 3. And that's kind of a leapfrogging or a stepping into a zone where GHG protocol is considering whether that could work for them. But I think, knowing what we do about market actors who are looking to buy emission reductions or sell them, this is a really positive step for, again, connecting that supply and demand, saying that this market-based accounting is valid. So wanted to just quickly touch on the definition of EAC because this shows up in a lot of the criteria and rules around market-based accounting. I know some folks can think of it or may associate it with energy attribute certificate, but what we're showing here is the SBTi definition from a July scope 3 paper, this broader term of environmental attribute certificate. And this, a renewable energy credit is one type of EAC, but so is a credit that would come from production of lower carbon steel or cement, and so is a carbon offset that would come from an emission reduction project outside a value chain. So just wanted to share this briefly, as we know we often get questions on this definition. But then maybe stepping again deeper on the market-based accounting topic, I think overall it's extremely positive, a huge deal that it's acknowledged as valid for scopes 1, 2, and 3 in this version of the draft. And that's, been an evolution. The V1 of the net zero standard only acknowledges it for scope 2. But a couple of places we wanted to highlight where, we have some concerns on the treatment of market-based accounting in this latest draft. And really, I would say these pieces fall into two buckets. One is that, the unbundled, the most flexible market-based accounting mechanisms, unbundled EACs, those are treated in a couple of places as sort of second best or should come after in sequencing to engagement with direct suppliers. And I see the intent behind that, but, concern there is just, again, resource constraints. If companies are able to pursue action, connect with an emission reduction project today, if we're telling them they have to do X, Y, and Z first, there's a concern that may stall some action. So that's, I'd say, sort of one area where we would provide feedback. We think these flexible mechanisms are equally powerful, so don't need to be treated as second best. And the other maybe aspect, the other theme represented by what we're showing here is, there's this fear of overcomplicating things. This, again, the resource constraints. If we're making people do more reporting and planning, are they going to be doing less action and implementation? And so some of the transition plan requirements or potentially the performance requirements needing ECs to come from similar geography, those may be, perfect being the enemy of the good in that territory. I know these are kind of contentious, but Kyra, I'd welcome, your thoughts, any context you want to share on these topics.
Sure. I mean, as you said, Emily, I think, there's ongoing work kind of across the ecosystem to better define some of the quality criteria and guardrails around the use of some of these instruments and around performance and claims, et cetera. So, again, just to reiterate, consultation status, right? Like this is kind of our initial draft and thinking from our research project that kicked off in 2024 around this topic, where we issued this tremendous call for evidence to kind of look at what, the state of the state was in terms of the use of these instruments, their maturity, et cetera. Since then, we've also had, obviously the first public consultation, an expert working group dedicated to scope 3. I mean, we've had expert working groups running throughout this project on various elements of the standard, but I suppose my main takeaway here would be rest assured that a lot of thought and deliberation and expertise and experience, et cetera, have been put into this initial draft. And we still want feedback, right? Especially from those like you and your company that are actually, doing some of the contracts and working through some of this in real time and on the ground. So that perspective, I think, is just really important to share back into this consultation.
Amazing. Well, really appreciate you sharing again that all the body of work that has gone into this, because we know that it's not, lightly arrived at. And I agree. I think, the best possible outcome is when the most voices are heard in this process. And I know SBTi is clearly working hard. You've got another webinar that starts right at the end of this, I think. So appreciate SBTi's work on that engagement piece. All right, well, let me turn it now to David to jump into the third of our key takeaways.
Thanks, Emily. It's great hearing you, Kyra, and Emily talk about the changes. I think scope 3, we went from a blanket targets to now these different options for companies. We've evolved from market-based accounting just for scope 2 to now the possibility of using it for scope 1 and scope 3. And I think another very pragmatic update is just moving from not thinking about ongoing emissions to beyond value chain mitigation, what it used to be called, to now taking responsibility for the ongoing emissions. And I think this is a direct result of the feedback the audience has given the SBTi over the past 2 years and SBTi listening to that feedback. So we were particularly thrilled to see in criteria C22 to C27 the mechanism, this recognition mechanism for companies who do want to take responsibility for ongoing emissions. On the next slide, we dive into two of the most fundamental aspects of that, which is a minimum viable threshold for being recognized as a company who's taken responsibility for ongoing emissions, and then a leadership tier for companies who want to demonstrate leadership, and there's key variables that are involved with that. Primarily, the carbon price you would apply are different. It's lower at the recognized level versus at the leadership level. And then the amount of emissions that you want to take responsibility of. Kyra, would you want to share a bit more about perhaps how did SBTi come around defining those thresholds and any context on just the journey? Because it honestly is, in our eyes, one of the biggest changes that SBTi has is considering.
Yeah, absolutely, David. So again, just to kind of reiterate this overall process, right? So we had this initial proposal in the first public consultation that really delineated what we were calling beyond value chain mitigation, or BVCM, lots of acronyms over here at SBTi, as well as kind of more the neutralization portfolio and taking responsibility for what we called residual emissions. So those that would occur at the net zero year and thereafter, after all potential abatement is achieved. So through a lot of various, again, deliberation, testing, through this first public consultation period, we landed on really more of an integrated approach to all ongoing emissions. So those would accompany those that are still, the emissions that a company is still emitting kind of on that path to net zero up until the net zero target year, and then those that remain at the net zero target year and thereafter, all within this bucket of ongoing emissions. And then we've proposed that in the beginning, kind of, near term, that companies can gain public recognition from the SBTi for voluntarily taking on some portion of responsibility for those ongoing emissions. Starting right now, as it's proposed, starting in 2035, Category A companies would actually be required to take some responsibility for those ongoing emissions. So again, this was in response to lots of stakeholder feedback, deliberation within our expert working groups. And we've actually, if you're interested, this is something that I don't know if a lot of people are aware of, but we've published research papers on some of these bigger topics and changes. So I will try to drop the link somewhere that the ClimeCo team can share out afterwards. But we actually have a whole research paper on why did we end up here on ongoing emissions and how did this happen? So yes, I'll share those afterwards if anyone's interested in some light reading.
Light reading indeed. We'll definitely make sure to send it as a follow-up to the recording and the presentation. And I think it's really interesting to see when we went through the guidance, for example, the ability it's two different carbon prices. The $20 per ton seems to hover on what the voluntary carbon market price seems to be looking at. And then the $80 per ton on the leadership seems to be around the compliance market. So again, all responding to market drivers. And then I think for most company A, what now will be called company A companies or category A companies, sorry, many of them are already doing this. Like we help them at ClimeCo, so it shouldn't be a big change. And I think any emission reduction, be it within the value chain or outside, is positive for the environment. I think one of the areas that on our team we're keeping an eye out on is again like what Emily described, perfect being the enemy of the good, as well as trying to make things as pragmatic and useful for companies who have resource constraints. And one of the things that on our end we've been very knowledgeable of is the use of other initiatives, right? The voluntary carbon market uses registries. There are new guidance that focus on proving that an investment is within a value chain. So one of the things that we look forward to hearing from the SBTi is, how do you look at these integrity principles and how do they map against initiatives that have already going into play? And I don't know, Kyra, is there anything you'd like the audience to know about this? Because I know it touches on removals as well, which has a longer timeline, but is there anything you want to raise on this point to the audience?
Just that, thank you for asking. I think one thing just to note right now is that there are quite a few things that are, again, under consultation at this point in time, specifically related to the ongoing emissions responsibility framework. There are also some questions specifically around is that 2035 mandatory requirement? Should it be moved up to 2030? What are some of the additional guardrails that should be in place there? Is there kind of, outstanding questions on durability? I think we've also communicated that some of these things we expect to actually develop greater clarity on in the next major update to the standard. So kind of as we near that 2030 mark, as we near that 2035 mark, we expect there to be more experience, more research, basically more to reference in terms of what's actually happening kind of in the market and on the ground. And so we expect that we will develop a bit more guidance kind of in the next major update.
Yeah, I think it's been 10 years since since it was announced, right? And like this update is really significant. So it would make sense, right, that there's another update. And I think all of us who are participating in this market are making it a robust process and impactful market in itself.
Yeah, I'm a little hesitant to call attention to the fact that there will be another major update. But just in case anyone's curious, why does SBTi keep updating their standards? Just pick one and go with it. As a standard setter, we're actually required to do that by our governance kind of process. Every 2 to 5 years, our standards require an update, and that's to remain aligned to the latest climate science. We know that the science is a bit different than it was 5 years ago. And to also kind of reflect best practices and integrate a lot more of that research and studies and things that have been done. We are the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and so we do try to look at the science.
Totally, totally. And at the end of the day, I think Emily, Garrett, and I will also make sure at times when we think there's things that should be prioritized, we always advise on that too. And for the audience, when you review this deck in your own time, we've listed in the top right corner just those areas in the document if you're strapped on time to focus your attention. But yeah, I think Kyra cued one of our exciting changes that we've noticed on the carbon removal side. So some of you might recall that in version 1.3, the need to purchase carbon removals doesn't truly hit until the year of your net zero target, which can be as far as 2050. But that makes it really difficult for project developers and for the businesses who are trying to provide that option, that service, which at times can be very capital intensive. So I think it's a very positive sign of this 2035 target that is shown in the next slide that has accelerated this timeline. And we do think it's important for all of us to reflect on whether is that quick enough, or again, it's already difficult to decarbonize. I think it's easier in some sectors versus others, but the reality is it's still a very difficult challenge. And what is necessary to smooth that process as much as possible for all of us who are participating in it, reduce the risk in the transition, and also help companies create value from it. So this is something that I definitely on our end will be responding when it comes to that timeline. We think it's extremely constructive and positive, but definitely looking forward to hearing from SBTi as well. The other considerations on 2035 and hypothetical pros and cons of going earlier. And I think, yeah, being mindful of time, Garrett, next one's on to you.
Thanks, David. Yeah, the final change that we wanted to highlight for all of you relates to the Scope 2 and renewable energy requirements. So you can see laid out here, as with the previous sections, some of the criteria that are most relevant. I wanted to note especially that C16 contains a lot of the specifics about how different versions of renewable energy can be used. So if you have opinions on that, that's a great place to go and provide some feedback. On the next slide, we've got some of the details on what changed in V2. So a few things to call out. Companies may now exclude some electricity emissions where appropriate. For example, if they're in a location that does not have access to low carbon electricity. Low carbon power has also been defined. So zero carbon is no longer a strict requirement. As you can see on the slide, 0.024 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour is defined as the threshold for low carbon here. And market and location-based approaches are now interchangeable. Location-based is no longer the required option. We also talked about this a little bit earlier, and I think there's more to be said, but SBTi has thankfully taken the initiative to help define some of the hourly matching requirements that are being proposed as part of the Scope 2 guidance that is being in discussion, I think, with a lot of standard setters right now. The current proposition is that only large annual consumers of greater than 10 gigawatt hours will be required to pursue hourly matching by 2030. Additionally, some of those integrity principles that David just discussed will apply to renewable energy and generally to energy certificates. We do think that this new level of stringency bring some positives. For example, making sure that the criteria are effective and that the right power is being used at the right time. However, we do have some concerns, and we've heard from a lot of market participants that additional requirements and increasingly specific criteria could stunt the growth of the voluntary market due to the same resource and knowledge constraints that we talked about earlier. Pulling lots of people, especially on small sustainability teams, in lots of directions, who of course don't all have deep knowledge in the renewable energy market. So, Kyra, I wanted to pass it over to you again to share a perspective on this requirement, especially.
Well, thanks, Garrett. And I think maybe I'll just start with, I know we've gotten, I think among many other proposals, but Scope 2, I think, caused maybe the most panic and heartburn that I witnessed, at least, kind of throughout the first public consultation period and the lead up to this revised draft, et cetera. We've had a lot of conversations with companies who were, expressed some true concerns on Scope 2. We've had conversations with groups like the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance. We've talked to a lot of folks really around a lot of these different elements. So just wanting to say that we hear you, we've heard, and we have tried to make adjustments. However, recognizing kind of what I was referencing earlier, science-based targets, a lot of our work kind of has come out of research that we've performed on what is needed to really drive kind of overall grid decarbonization, what is really needed to drive this overall transition to net zero. And so we're hoping to strike a good balance of how do we effectively start to build up that demand, right, at kind of a more local level and at a more, kind of that time and temporal level, while recognizing that it truly isn't feasible for some companies and some markets, et cetera. So it's a hard balance to strike. I think we're seeing that at SBTi. We're seeing it with the ongoing Scope 2 consultation at Greenhouse Gas Protocol. But I'm confident that we will all reach a place that we can all at least feel good about and feel like we're progressing towards the same kind of North Star destination.
Yeah, thanks, Kyra. I saw that we received a few questions about that in the chat, so appreciate answering that. I think it's a contentious topic, but it's one that's really important, and obviously a lot of people really care about the result there. So I'll move us on in this for the sake of time to the last slide we've got here before next steps, future thoughts here. So finally, there's just a few last requirements that we did not discuss that we thought were worth mentioning on the webinar today. So one of them that we want to call out specifically is the transition plan. So companies will be required to publish a transition plan within 12 months of validation that outlines their pathway to net zero. And that transition plan must be reviewed and updated at least every 5 years. So this is a substantial requirement. Again, that was not part of the first consultation of V2. And I'll prime you on that in a second, Kyra. Some of the other changes that we talked about already include company categorization, so making it easier for some of these Category B companies to not have to comply necessarily with all of the same constraints that Category A companies have to comply with, which we think is a really great and positive change. Requiring proposed limited assurance for base year emissions, and that's under consultation, of course. And then providing some more guidance around claims and reporting and transparency throughout the document. So, Kyra, let me ask you if you have any thoughts on the transition plan requirement.
Sure. I mean, I think we've gotten some questions on will SBTi be validating these transition plans? Like, is that like a whole separate validation process, et cetera? And at this point in time, that we're just requiring that companies would publish those transition plans. So I think we would provide maybe some external benchmarks on what maybe some best practices are. We know that there's groups out there that are dedicated towards really developing best practices around what a good solid transition plan looks like. so right now, kind of the proposal is that companies would just need to make those available to the public within that 12-month period after that initial validation. And the rationale here, I think, is that we know that establishing a target, establishing that ambition is fantastic, but there's a need for that added layer of accountability. How is a company getting there? What is the plan? Where are they going to put investments? So that's kind of the reason that we have introduced this overall kind of new proposal and new requirement.
Yeah, thanks, Kyra. That's super interesting. Yeah, looking forward to hearing everyone's feedback, and we've got questions coming up in a second. But first, I will pass it off to David to just do a quick wrap up.
Thank you, Garrett. And Kyra, I think your explanation on the climate transition plans speaks to some of the experience Emily, Garrett, and I have had with clients as well, where we at times have had to develop very detailed climate transition plans with cost information before a company felt comfortable to get a target validated. And on the other side, others who've done it in reverse. So I do think some of that guidance is definitely appreciated. But anyways, this is a lot to digest. We hope the part of this conversation has been helpful to kind of shorten learning curve for all of you. And again, please do respond to the second public consultation. So our call to action is this 3-point action plan for those who have the time. So number one, the deadline is December 12th. So in 10 days, please give Kyra and the SBTi team your thoughts. There's been wonderful changes that make this more pragmatic, prioritizes impact, and accelerates the timelines. And just the best version of this is one where Kyra's team and the SBTi team can truly understand all the nuances from category A to category B companies from different sort of sectors. So please do that. Pilot transactions for environmental attribute credits. So Emily spent a lot of time articulating this wonderful change where we can leverage market-based accounting beyond scope 2 now. We've seen the benefits of this when it comes to renewable energy. Let's capture these benefits for low carbon fuels, for low carbon materials. There are standards out there that are trying to help SBTi in articulating how to do those things. And then they're teams like ours where we can help identify where there's low-hanging fruit, where you can share lessons learned and be prepared when this becomes standard practice, when the version 2 becomes a finalized document. And last but not least, start thinking about developing an environmental credit strategy. What does that mean? Well, that connects to that climate transition plan. So historically, most companies would think about what interventions you would have to invest yourself and own yourself across your value chain. At times, think about the cost involved. The expansion of market-based accounting provides an opportunity to identify levers to hit your targets, perhaps in a more cost-effective manner. But the whole market's going to have that same opportunity. So what role do these EACs play? What role do carbon offsets play? What role do carbon removals play? They all play a role now thanks to SBTi's current version 2 guidance, and understanding the role and the balance of them all is pretty mission critical now for any company that is transitioning to net zero. So start thinking about that as we still have some time for SBTi to kind of finalize this guidance. And with that, I think the last slide on this deck has some resources for all of you. So please don't hesitate to reach out to Kyra, Emily, Garrett, or I if you have any questions. And we'll just kind of open the floor for a Q&A.
Great. Thank you, David. Let's start off with a question about getting behind the scenes. So Kyra, this one's targeted at you. What does SBTi look and feel like these days? How many people are on the team responding to these thousands of comments? Could you give us a little bit of a glimpse behind the scenes as to how this process has unfolded?
Sure, Garrett. Well, as I mentioned, we've had quite a few different ways that we're gathering input into this overall process. But what I can say is that we maintain both a research team. So these are, our folks that are really dedicated towards conducting literature reviews, feasibility analysis, looking at the market, looking at trends, et cetera. So we have a whole team that's dedicated just to that, of really integrating the science into science-based targets. Then we have kind of our more corporate standards team. We have a stakeholder engagement team. We have the impact team where I sit. Overall, the whole SBTi, we've grown. Some people are shocked at this number. I think some people think that we're huge. Some people think that we're tiny. We're kind of right in the middle, maybe. But we've grown to about over 200 people total. which is pretty tremendous, but we would like more, we've got a lot of demand, but we had a pretty significant team that was combing through over, I think when you get down to the final count, we had to look at over 1,100 pieces of feedback via survey responses. We had 855 formal survey responses to that first public consultation. We had another 320 very much more in-depth surveys to go through from our first round of pilot testing. And then we have letters, feedback we received through webinars like this. So there's a tremendous amount to kind of sort through, as well as running those expert working groups. So again, this is 100 external technical experts in their field, across industry, academia, nonprofits, et cetera, that were really contributing to a lot of the thought and deliberation that went into these proposals.
Wow. That's a lot of work for 200 people. So we really appreciate you always being so open to comments and having several rounds of consultation, really just helping everybody land at the best possible version of the standard. Next, we had a few questions about this, so let me dive into this topic. Several people asked about how SBTi feels about the need for harmonization around the ongoing work with EACs at GHG Protocol, ISO, and other standards.
Yeah, Garrett. So I marked a lot of those. It's like, yeah, we can answer those live. There's a ton of questions. I think I get this question maybe a couple times a day, to be honest. And if I'm at a conference, maybe 20. There are so many questions around what is the relationship between SBTi and greenhouse gas protocol. I think some people even think we're this one and the same. I think there's just a lot of kind of confusion on how some of the standard setters work together and harmonize. So what I can tell you is that, SBTi, we reference greenhouse gas protocol for accounting, right? We, unless otherwise specified in our standards and guidance, which occasionally there is a specification where we diverge from greenhouse gas protocol in one way or another. But in general, we look to reference greenhouse gas protocol for best practices in accounting. In general, we would like to stay harmonized as best we can. We actually have a team that we've started to build up within my department. This is our technical interoperability team. So really they're tasked with contributing into and listening to the developments that are going on with greenhouse gas protocol, with ISO, with some of these other standard setting bodies, and ensuring that SBTi is at least interoperable, right? So to the extent possible, harmonized, totally aligned. And in some cases, if not, it's clear why and how. So that's to say, we are actively contributing to some of those working groups that are ongoing right now. We've had greenhouse gas protocol folks active and ISO contributing into SBTi's working groups. So there's a lot of overlap, but ultimately we are independent organizations, and every so often we may need to slightly diverge depending on the topic.
Yeah, thanks, Kyra. Super interesting. And I mean, there's just so many different people, speaking with loud voices, and it's hard to hear everybody all at the same time. So great to hear that you guys have that interoperability group. Okay, another question about timeline here. So as I understand, the new standard won't take effect until 2028. Curious why the delay?
So that I want to make very crystal clear. The new standard will go into effect, meaning companies can use it the day that it is published, which we are anticipating will happen in 2026. So that is obviously a fairly impossible situation, right? That some company can go and set a target against a finalized standard the day it's published, but that is when it's available to use. So that will happen sometime in 2026. There will be a period of overlap where companies can elect to use version 1.3, or they can elect to use version 2. That 2028 marker, January 1st, 2028, is when version 2 becomes mandatory, as in former versions of our standards will be no longer available to use and will be retired. So at that point, for companies setting new targets or updating targets, they will need to use version 2. For companies with existing net zero targets that maybe have a mandatory 5-year review in that period, there will be additional transition guidance that's issued specifically for that cohort of companies. And that will be at a later date, probably when we have a little bit more of a firm grasp on where some of these proposals land.
Great. Thanks for that, Kyra. Yeah, I can't believe we got another webinar right after this one. We're going to keep grilling you with questions and hopefully
A
give
day
you
in the
time
life.
to
Yeah.
It's perfect. Another one on, let's go over to the ongoing emissions. So 1% and 100% are pretty far apart. Could you tell us the thinking behind these two levels?
Yes, absolutely. So I almost had the same reaction, I have to be honest. I said, whoa, these are totally different. These are wildly different. So again, as I mentioned, there's kind of those research papers out there. If you want to dive into one on how these were arrived at, you can. But essentially that 1% was determined through a fairly robust feasibility analysis that looked at overall kind of cross-sector modeling of corporate profits, emissions intensity, and carbon credit price data. We landed at that 1% contribution across all scopes, so scopes 1, 2, and 3, would make a meaningful contribution, but would at least set the bar somewhat low enough to encourage participation from the broadest variety of sectors and company sizes, et cetera. So we're really trying to look at that fine balance between meaningful enough, but not being prohibitive to where companies can't participate in this program, right? However, I will say that that 1% is under consultation. So there is a specific survey question on, should it be different? Should it be higher? So we are openly kind of looking for feedback on that threshold. The 100% threshold, I think, is a little less up for debate or consultation. Of course, one thing that people don't realize, I think, is almost everything's under consultation. If you want to put your feedback into an open text box, you can do that. Or you can, email one of us. But that one, we think that should truly be a leader. And it is intentionally a bit North Star, high in the sky. But to be a real, true leader in this space, you would be taking responsibility for 100% of those ongoing emissions.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kyra. And we certainly agree here at ClimeCo. Emily, I've got one question for you that came through the chat.
Sure.
You mentioned that ClimeCo has a trade desk. Could you speak more about this? What instruments are available and what role does ClimeCo play in the transactions themselves?
Yeah, for sure. Happy to answer. The trade desk that we've got has been around for ClimeCo's 15 years. So we've got some of the pioneers of the voluntary carbon market on our team. And really, the role that they play is they are working on moving any of those environmental attributes, buying, selling, trading, warehousing. Those are all the roles that they play. And so for the ClimeCo team, and for the clients that we work with, in many cases, they're looking to reduce emissions and find a way to monetize those. Our trade desk is out finding those buyers. But the converse is true too. If folks are looking for the recs they need to meet their targets for the year, our trade desk is there as well. So really working with any sort of environmental attributes and pretty busy on a daily basis. Back to you,
Okay,
Garrett.
great. Thanks, Emily. And I think we've got time for maybe just one more. So I'll ask one more to you, Kyra, about absolute targets. So how does SBTi see these different target types eventually converging to the absolute reductions required for achieving net zero? Keen to hear more on why absolute reduction targets were removed as an option for short-term targets.
Yeah, I think that we've been getting this question too on, well, maybe just to reiterate, absolute emission targets are still available in scope 1, and there's some optional additional targets that you can set in scope 2, in addition to an alignment target, a low carbon electricity alignment target in scope 2. In scope 3, what we have kind of, the whole approach to scope 3, we've just kind of changed maybe just narrowed the aperture a little bit is the best way to say it. And that, again, we're really trying to prioritize these near-term actions, these near-term interventions that we think companies can make, and that will hopefully focus companies' investment into those priority sources. Eventually, and again, TBD, right? We will have some other major updates to the standard. But as we get down the road where some of these things have hopefully built up markets and have built up some of the scale that we need and have built up the investment and the finance flows and all of these things that we really want to see to start decarbonizing broadly, maybe again, the focus will turn back to, okay, we think we're confident that we can go after these absolute emission reduction targets in scope 3 again, and that we've got kind of the infrastructure to do that. But for right now, we're just really focused on what's going to maximize impact now.
Awesome. Thank you, Kyra. We really could not have done this without you, so we super appreciate you being here. I see that we've just hit the hour, so thanks so much to all of our participants for being here today. As I said at the beginning of the call, we will send out the recording and the slides to everybody who registered. Please do email any of us if you have any questions. We really look forward to it. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.
Well.
Thank you all.